Jambo Rafiki, I'm Elizabeth from Qitsualik-Tinsley, and I hope you are doing really well. If you're new to my channel, welcome, and if you've been here before, welcome back. I release 2 videos a week. On Tuesdays, I talk about books and all things books, and on Fridays, I talk about journaling and all things creative play. So today I thought I would do a quick wrap-up of the comics that I have read recently. So I tend to read a variety of books in a variety of formats and types of books. And so what I wanted to do was, graphic novels and comics to me is a genre that has really come into its own. It is no longer the superhero only kinds of comic books. And in some ways, I think this particular genre or this particular way of telling a story is way more effective than prose or even nonfiction books can be in terms of introducing us to new ideas and concepts and themes. And so what I wanted to do was quickly go over 3 of the series of books that I have read recently and just kind of talk a little bit about them. I'm going to review them in the order of my least favorite to the one that I like the most. So first off, we have Solutions and Other Problems by Allie Brosh. Now, I'm not a huge memoir fan. I tend to have this love-hate relationship with memoirs because at the end of the day, unless you've done something that I am intrinsically interested in, or you've had a life that is intrinsically of interest to me, I'm not really interested in reading memoirs of any Tom, Dick, and Harry, right? So, or Jane, as the case might be. So the question becomes, why do I pick up memoirs? I'm picking them up because I'm looking to glean some insight from someone else whose life has dived some depths so that I learn something from it, or to be entertained. These are the 2 reasons I tend to read memoirs. And sometimes I find ones that are really, really great. So again, I'm not against all memoirs. I'm just a little bit more leery when I pick them up. Now, this particular book, Solutions and Other Problems, I have read Allie Brosh before. I read Hyperbole and a Half, and I liked it. I thought it was okay. I mean, she's got a huge following, and I, for one, I'm always curious when I see that to try and understand what it is that people are resonating with. This particular book, as I said in my physical TBR video that I'll link for you if you wanted to go take a look at that, is a physically heavy book. It's got really wonderful color photographs. I mean, the art in here in terms of being in full color is really a nice touch. However, I'm not a huge fan of her style of illustrations. They don't really work for me. They're okay, but this kind of sketchy, thing that she draws, doesn't really work for me. And unlike a normal comic, this particular book has got it's more essays, so it's illustrated essays, if you will. There's a lot more text in this. And as with all of these videos or books I'm talking about today, I'll try and insert a video clip so you can kind of see what the illustration styles look like for all of these. It didn't really work for me. I thought it was okay. It wasn't great. I found myself, the first couple of essays, if you will, okay, they were okay. But I found myself putting the book down and not wanting to pick it back up again. And when that happens to me, it's a clear sign this is not a book I should be reading. DNF, move on, which is exactly what I did. I DNF'd this one. Too bad. I just don't think she's an author for me. But it might work better for you if you like illustrated memoirs, and in particular, kind of the way, if her memoirs work for you, you might find this one better suited to your taste, just not one for me. Next up, I have a book that is called This Place, 150 Years Retold. And if you take a look at that physical TBR, I will post a link to, I was really excited about this book. This was one that I think was one of my most anticipated comics in the last year. And this one, it should have been great. It should have been great. So it's an anthology, and it's an anthology written by and illustrated by First Nations people. So it's short stories, if you will, of fictional, historical fiction, sci-fi, crimes. There's some serial killer stuff. There's some magical realism, but it's all told from on voices perspectives, right? So it's snippets, if you will, of the First Nations history and their stories. And this should have been brilliant. This should have been a 5-star read for me, and it wasn't. And primarily because of a couple of reasons, okay? So number one, it's an anthology, which means there are multiple authors whose work is represented in here, and as well as multiple illustrators. I liked some of the stories better than I liked others, but overall, nothing really stuck out for me, right? There was no one particular story that I just was like, whoa, this was amazing. Okay, so that's one. Two is it's a story about Native people. And if you read anything about how people from the West, as they have colonized and moved into other areas of the world, just how First Nations or Aboriginal people were treated, okay, you know it's going to be horrific. I was expecting some of that. And there is some descriptions of, like what happens when families are split apart because of residential schools, and what happens when you cannot speak your own language, or you cannot spend time with your own family because the government forcibly separates you from your family. There are repercussions to that. And so some of that is there. But as a person who's read more of this kinds of story, there was nothing new in it for me. The way the book is formatted is that they are, each story, if you will, starts with kind of, here's an overview of why the author wants to tell the story. And there's a quick, version of either a historical person in history, kind of a quick bio of that person, or kind of what motivated the author to write this particular story. And then there's also a timeline about, laws and, first contact in terms of history. And then you go into the story. Like I said, it was okay. Here's the part that I thought was mind-blowing for me. When we read dystopian novels or, apocalyptic fiction, it's all about what happens after the disaster, right? How do people cope? What happens to them next? And this book starts off with the concept or the idea that for First Nations, which is primarily Canada, or Native Americans as we call them here in the US, for them, first contact was the apocalyptic event. That for these people, what the everything after first contact is the dystopian world that they are living in. And I had just never thought of it in that context, which is one of the reasons why I think reading on voices is so great, right? Because the perspectives they bring to the table are very, very different than what you would even be aware of. So for that reason alone, I think this is the collection worth picking up. If you are completely new to First Nations history, this is certainly worth picking up to kind of sample it. Made my expectations, I was expecting more, and it just did not deliver on that. I liked it. I read them, I would pick up a story and read a story and put the book down, because I find that to be true when I'm reading short story collections in general, is to give myself the space between stories to let things settle. I found myself reluctant to pick the book up again, and I actually, in the last couple of days, forced myself to finish it, because I just wanted to find that story that was going to make this reading experience worthwhile for me. And as I said, the idea of everything after first contact being the dystopian post-apocalyptic world that First Nations people are living in, that's their worldview, that was worth it for me. Okay, so overall, I thought the book was okay. Some of the art I liked better than others. Some of the stories I liked better than others. I ended up giving this one 2 stars. And finally, what I wanted to talk about was a series called Something is Killing the Children. Now, I tend to save most of my horror reading for the end of the year, kind of around Thanksgiving time frame. But after reading these first 2 comics, I love comics. They're one of my palette cleansers between some of the more heavy tomes that I read. They're also really fun and fast to get through. And I was so discouraged by those first 2 books that I just talked about that I was like, I just need something that's going to get me swept up in a story. And so this particular series gets a lot of love. And so I thought, okay, the volume 1 and volume 2 showed up from my library in the physical version. And I thought, I might as well start this and see. And it is fun, right? So what's the story about? in this town called Archer's Peak, somewhere in middle America, small town America, children start disappearing. And so kids disappear, never to be seen again, or they disappear and they are found dead. And when they are found dead, they are very badly mutilated. Okay, so for people who are not fans of that, I would stay clear of this comic. But what it does really well is explore this town. How do you deal with that when this is happening to children? And then there is this woman, I think her name is Erica Slaughter. Her last name is Slaughter. I remember that for sure. She comes into town, and what she's going to do is when we first meet her, we kind of get a sense that she's a monster hunter. So she comes into town, but now you've got this interesting dynamic, right? She has this idea of what she's going to be able to do to help. But the townsfolk are in this crisis, and why would you trust a stranger that you have never seen before who says that they're going to help? What does that actually mean? I mean, distrust of strangers on a good day is high. So in this particular context, as you can imagine, is pretty high. So I don't want to spoil anything in this book, but the ideas or themes that this book explores is kind of really interesting. It's this notion of what does fear look like? How does fear manifest, for example? What do monsters look like? And who can see monsters and who can kill them? And just how does a town work around this, right? How does a town resolve this? Because there's so much grief in this particular situation, and horror. And the kids who survive an attack, they have some pretty horrific stories to share. So I highly recommend this one if this sounds good to you, the concept sounds good to you. I read Volume 1 and Volume 2, which collect issues 1 through 10. This is not a completed series. So I also read the standalone issues 11, 12, and 13. So I believe there are 2 more that's going to wrap this whole thing up. It's a fun, if albeit gory, fast read. Kind of, Stranger Things like. So if you're a fan of Stranger Things, this is kind of that same idea, just with a lot more gore up front as opposed to things happening in the background. So I'd recommend this for fans of that. If they are much, much better comics, horror comics in general written, and if you're interested in that, let me know and I'll put together a list for you to take a look at. But it was a fun, got me back into reading the comics. And this was an example of I finished one and I picked the next installment up immediately. That's what I tend to want from my comics, not put them down and I don't ever want to touch that book again. Okay, so I gave this series 3 stars. Like I said, not the best in the genre, but it's definitely a fun ride if you're into that kind of thing. So that's what I have for you today. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down below. If you've read any of these books, and I would love to know what you thought about them. If you have other comics, especially that you're interested in hearing me talk about, let me know. And if you have comics that you love and you think I might enjoy them, I would love to hear your recommendations as well. That's what I have for you today. And until I talk to you next time, happy reading. Bye.